All right, hello, and welcome everybody. Oh my goodness, we've got a special day for you planned today. It's me, Kevin. You guys know me. Today, on this lovely snow day, this cold February day, via Zoom, we have joining us very famous macro economist that works here at WKU. We have Chris Biolzi. Very happy to have Chris join us today to talk about GDP and its usefulness as a measure of well-being across countries. No, I know a little bit about economics. I got a master's degree. Chris has the whole PhD, the whole nine. And Chris, you worked as a macroeconomist briefly. Is that right?
I did.
What did that look like?
It was well, it looked like anything else. You sit at a desk and you have a computer and you've got paper, and it's fantastic. That's
Okay,
what
so
it
that's
looked
what
like.
it looked like.
I looked like a standard workaday drone in a nondescript white collar office. That's what it looked like.
And what did
It
you
was
do
great.
when you were in this role?
Oh, I helped produce the forecast for the executive branch of the government, the macroeconomic forecast. We would forecast GDP, Kevin.
Wow. So what you're saying is you're an expert on GDP.
As much as I'm an expert on anything, I'm an expert on the definition of GDP.
Well, that's great. All right, let's go ahead. I've got some slides prepared, and I figure we'll start with this right here. Let me see here. Doggies. All right, now we're talking. So our question of interest today, is per capita gross domestic product the best measure of individual well-being across countries?
What does per capita mean, Kevin?
Oh, well, that's a great question. Let's make sure we're all on the same page as far as what means what here. So let's get a quick reminder in here. Oh, looks like our heads might cut it off just a little bit, but let me read this definition to you. Gross domestic product is going to be the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country's border within a given amount of time. So essentially, we can think of this as the value in dollars of everything an economy produces, or equivalently, national income. How much does our country make? Now, per capita, this is a very, very special phrase coming from the Latin that's going to tell us per person.
I didn't know it came from the Latin.
I believe so. Per capita, CAP, per person. Mm-hmm.
That's
per
interesting.
head in the Latin, yes, cap.
I had
Anywho,
no
so
idea.
it's income per head. So we're going to take this lovely gross domestic product number and divide it by our population to give us gross domestic product per capita or per person. So essentially the question we're going to take up is average income per person the best measure for comparing the well-being of individuals across country? Essentially, that's the question we're looking at. Not exactly, but more or less that's the idea. You agree with that, all that, Chris?
I absolutely agree with it.
Well, cool. As we sit here, what position do you really take on this, Chris?
I think we're there so soon. I think it is a very good way to get a rough comparison of average well-being across countries. You're looking for one number, Kevin, just one. You look at all kinds of numbers, but then you get confused. If you have one number that gives you a rough sense, just a rough one, of how well people in one country are doing relative to another, GDP is probably the best measure.
GDP is the best measure of a rough sense of well-being of individuals across countries. All right. Well, let's hear that pro position fleshed out a little bit. So here are some of the arguments associated with why we might want to use GDP per person as this measure of how well off individuals across countries are. it should be really clear, this is one of the most important questions of macroeconomics, right? How do we compare well-being across countries? And using that to compare our countries is going to be very useful. So GDP is going to be important. One reason we might want to use it is, like you said, as far as a rough estimate of a lot of good stuff. Well, GDP correlates with all sorts of good measurements that we care about, right? Life expectancy and stuff like that. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that even undersells it a little bit. I mean, certainly if you have higher GDP, you can afford higher education, as you say in your slide, but it's more than that, right? Because if you're highly educated, that not only gives you the ability to get a job that pays you a lot of money, but also gives you a greater capacity for enjoying life. You could read poetry and actually understand what's going on. You could write poetry. You can, understand music on a deeper level. And that brings greater joy to you and everyone's life, I think.
That's a really interesting point that I haven't really thought through before. So you're saying having this greater national income, this greater GDP allows us to invest in things like education, but then having that investment allows us to live more fulfilling lives generally?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Have you ever watched a movie, Kevin? Like, I know you're a big Christopher Nolan fan, but to actually understand what's going on in these Christopher Nolan movies requires a certain amount of attention and, understanding of. You're the expert on Christopher Nolan, not me. But references and science and all of this stuff. So to really appreciate a Christopher Nolan movie, you need to be pretty smart, I think.
I think that's pretty fair. I think that's pretty fair. I do have a qualm with it though, I suppose what you're trying to tell me is that I didn't appreciate Inception until after I earned my master's degree.
Well, I have a PhD, Kevin, and I still don't fully appreciate Inception. So it's again rough measures only.
Sure. But I do see what you're saying. I think that's a very strong argument. Do you think that we get similar benefits from investing in other things like healthcare?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's not just about being healthy, but if you're healthy, you can also go for a hike in the woods. That's what really makes you happy. I mean, it's nice to be healthy. It's nice not to have diseases or anything like that. But what really, makes your life worth living is the ability to do something with that health. Whether you want to play football or, like I said, go hiking, whatever.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point, and that's something that we don't think about enough. Sometimes there's ripple effects, benefits to benefits, returns on returns when it comes to things like this. Is that a tail? A tail's in your face?
That's a tail in my face. Well, technically, what was in my face was a butthole, but yeah, you only saw the tail.
Wow. Well, there we go.
This is a PG-13 rated podcast, Kevin. Is that right?
Yeah. Little did I know. We got Mari the dog making a little spicing things up a little bit there. So obviously, intuitively, we know countries with higher incomes, higher GDPs are the ones with the healthier, wealthier citizens. So this may be a good measurement. I've got here a lovely list of, probably a little outdated list, but the top 20 countries according to GDP per capita. That is GDP per capita on the right-hand side as measured by the International Monetary Fund, IMF. And of course, we see in this list of top 20, a lot of the countries that we would want to go to or potentially live in. It's wealthy, healthy countries, generally with freer peoples, generally with lots of good political rights, lots of education, all sorts of wonderful things that you would want associated with your country. Does this list spark any thoughts in you about this topic?
Well, I think in general, I would agree with you. Like most of these countries are very nice places to live, even if they're some of them are pretty cold, like Norway and Iceland and places like that. But it's also a good indicator that it's not that GDP per capita is not the be all end all, because while Qatar is a very wealthy country according to GDP per capita, it's not necessarily a place that the average Qatari is doing very well, because in Qatar they have very high levels of income inequality, which I think you're going to get to.
I think you're right. Absolutely. So there's a lot of stuff that GDP is not picking up, right? It's a rough shot measurement, and it's only going to get big ideas. Speaking of big ideas, I think this heat map of GDP also kind of highlights this idea that it's the darker green in this image, the more wealthy the place, or I should say higher income per person country. And those very dark green ones are going to be those making greater than $60,000 a year per person. So obviously we can see, North America, Europe, as well as East Asia are going to be the places that really take off. I think that's a pretty, this heat map kind of shows what GDP is getting at. I feel like the kinds of things we can associate with the countries in green versus the countries in particularly like darker orange or red is kind of highlighting just how important GDP is. But rolling on here, here's GDP plotted against life expectancy at birth, and we can see it's a real good, real strong trend here, right? Not perfect, but strong correlation. We see similar correlation for average years of schooling, and also for satisfaction with life. Now, this one may be the weakest of the three trends, but certainly they're all going in the same general direction. The richer the country, the healthier, the wealthier, the happier. Do you have anything to add to that?
Not really, but I will say that looking at satisfaction with life makes me think about gross national happiness, which some people have tried to propose as another way of comparing quality of life across countries. Do you know anything about gross national happiness, Kevin?
You'll have to fill me in, Chris. What do you think about it?
Well, I mean, I don't think much about it at all, but it was coined by one of the founding fathers of the European Union. And it's basically, the idea is you just measure how happy everyone in the country is, and you use that instead of GDP. Life's about being happy, not about how much you produce.
That's pretty fair.
There's some problems with that measure, of course.
Just a survey of all the people?
Yeah, you just walk around and say, how happy are you? And then you'd say, really happy. And then they count that 8 times. I have no idea.
Well, that's pretty interesting. I think this same, this slide I've got here probably suffers from the same issues. It is kind of difficult just to ask somebody a question and then quantify their fulfillment in life. That seems a little hard to me to get into a survey, but maybe. Again, a few reasons we might not want to use GDP. It's going to miss, like you're talking about, happiness, right? Maybe even though I'm rich, I'm not happy. Maybe money can't buy happiness, and maybe money.
I don't believe it.
You don't believe it? You think money
can buy
can
a lot of happiness with money? You can get a boat. You can, live on an island. But that's I'm idiosyncratic that way.
No, I think that's pretty fair. I think that's where that's the strength of the argument in favor of using GDP to measure well-being across countries. One interesting point that I kind of came up when I was thinking about this is missing health effects, especially those related to overconsumption. I thought about how for generally, there's higher GDP per capita is associated with higher health outcomes like life expectancy and things like this. Um, One point, perhaps a really, really rich country like the US allows us to overconsume of things like cigarettes and fast food and stuff, and may hurt our ability to enjoy our lives. Maybe we get so rich that we can end up hurting ourselves with our consumption. What do you think about that, Chris?
Well, I don't think the relationship's perfectly linear. I think it is certainly true that when you reach a certain level of income, you may start over consuming things like fast food, like you said. But I think what we've observed, right, even in this country, is that very wealthy people also tend to be healthier than middle income or poor people because they have access to, better grocery stores with fresher foods, fresher ingredients. They're less reliant on fast food. They may not have to, they may not face the time crunches that a lot of working class or middle class people face, where sometimes getting fast food is the best way to feed your family at night because you just don't have the time. Whereas wealthy people may not have that, they may not face the same kind of constraints. So I would suggest that it's not quite linear. It's not necessarily the case that as you get richer, you automatically get healthier. There's more complex things going on.
Certainly. A correlation, not a perfect linear relationship or anything like that. Just a general trend together. Well, you mentioned one. What else might we use? So we might use our gross national happiness. What else did you say?
Well, I mean, one thing GDP doesn't do is really get at the quality of our leisure time. So, one thing, if you look at that table that you showed everyone a few slides ago, France was pretty well down the list. I mean, globally speaking, still pretty good, but relative to other rich countries, France is fairly low income. But one thing they do in France is they have laws that limit how much you can work in a week, which sounds a little bit silly to us as Americans, but you could kind of see the rationale there, where now French people have more time to enjoy the things that they can buy with their GDP. They have more time to read books on philosophy or poetry or whatever, and more time to watch movies and more time to go hiking. Whereas in America, we may be expected to work many more hours in a week, and we'll be too tired at the end of the week to really enjoy those things. So the quality of our leisure time is really important.
Okay, so quality of leisure time might be a potential measure. Is that what you're
Yes.
saying?
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying. Yes.
I got a short list of a few other ones. Obviously, we've talked about it already. Life expectancy at birth might measure how healthy we are and how that's improving over time. And maybe the goal of our country is just to live long, happy lives. Infant mortality, I think, is one that's not talked about enough, which would be the number of infants that die in the first year out of 1,000. I think
And
that's a good
relative to
measure.
other rich countries, we do pretty badly on that statistic.
We do. I think that's a big one, though. I think it measures health. It measures the emphasis you put on the future, all sorts of different things. I was curious if you thought the Gini index might have something to say on this question.
Well, I think inequality in general is pretty important. We kind of mentioned Qatar, right? Which on average, you'd look at Qatar and say that's a very rich country. But most of the income accrues to the ruling family and the people that are close to them. And the average, the median Qatari does not get to enjoy nearly that high a level of well-being. So I think that's a particularly, again, it's not the be all end all. A little bit of inequality is not a bad thing, but excessive inequality can be bad, not least because especially if you think about a country like the United States, which is a democracy, if inequality gets to be too bad, then it may lead to political movements that look to expropriate wealth from high income or high wealth people, which may be, there's, you can have differing views on this, but there's a risk that you could overdo such policies and that could essentially kill the golden goose and strip away the country's ability to be rich in the first place. So one argument for addressing inequality is to prevent bad policies that are born out of that inequality.
That's really interesting. I've never heard that idea before. So what you're arguing is, we need to take inequality into account because if we allow it to get out of hand, perhaps the kind of political repercussions of allowing our country to be so, just a handful of few that are so insanely rich and so many that are so poor may create bad policy and tear up our country in the long run. That what you're saying?
Yep. French Revolution didn't go well for anybody, I would argue.
I think that's pretty fair. I don't think there'd be a lot of French folks to take the opposing perspective on that.
Maybe.
So just to clarify, the Gini index is a measure of inequality, and I think I've got a graph. Yeah, this is a graph here that highlights that the darker blues are lower inequality, and the lighter colors are higher inequality. And I think we can notice some of the highest inequality in South America and in Africa, particularly in like Brazil, countries like this, right?
And Qatar has a very light color too.
Oh my goodness, yes. Look at that. A lot of those Middle Eastern countries having very, very light colors.
If they have data, I can't.
Looks
My
like it's
screen
no
is
data.
not perfect. Yeah. But you can also see, Kevin, that a lot of people seem to think that the Nordic countries really have it figured out because they're very rich countries and they're also very equal as well. It's not to say that they have it perfect, but you can see why some people really admire the Nordic countries like Sweden and Norway and Denmark do.
Certainly, certainly. Well, one last measure that we might use instead, I found interesting, the Human Development Index. Are you familiar with the Human Development Index, Chris?
I've heard of it.
So it seems to be an index that takes into account three metrics: life expectancy, years of education, and GDP per capita. Or I believe they actually do GNI per capita. But essentially the same idea, bringing together how long you're going to live, how many years you'll be educated, and how much money you'll make. What do you think about that as a more holistic measurement?
I mean, there's always going to be debates about how you combine different metrics together. It's not as easy as it might seem on the surface. But in general, I think it's a worthy goal. You're trying to combine a lot of different measures into one number that's easy to digest. So from that perspective, I think it's a good ambition.
Well, I agree. There's certainly not a lot more ambitious of a goal than trying to, see which countries are doing better or worse in general and in specific categories and measurements. One of the big questions of macroeconomics generally, and I'm really glad we could sit down and talk about it today. I do have this lovely quote from Robert F. Kennedy that's you can find in our ManQ textbook. Really, really good stuff.
Kevin, it is legally required that you read this quote in a Boston accent.
I'll let you do it. So, Chris, you're the native New Englander. I'll let you.
I'm not a native New Englander. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to make a fool out of myself on camera. I'll do it for my class, though.
That's pretty fair. That's pretty fair. Well, I guess you'll have to head over to Chris's YouTube channel to see him give this quote in a Boston accent.
A bad Boston accent.
Well, there you go. All right. Well, thank you guys very much. I think we're going to go ahead and sign off of here.
Thanks for inviting me, Kevin.
Oh, of course. We're pleased to have you.